You're listening to Thunderquack Podcast Network. This is the Thunderquack Podcast, the official podcast of Thunderquack Podcast Network, where anything can happen. So strap yourselves in and hold on to your butts. It's Thunderquack time!
Hey everybody, how's it going? This is the Thunderquack Spoilercast for Black Panther. We're here with some members of the Thunderquack podcast community here. I'm going to be your host, Kyle Avery from Star Wars The Saga Continues. And with me I've got actually my fellow co-host from The Saga Continues, Tim Geraci. How's it going, Tim?
Hey, what's up, Kyle? Doing good. A little weird not replying with a Star Wars comment or a subject like I usually do, but I'm excited to talk about Black Panther on this one.
Yeah, I know, right? I feel like I'm just introducing Tim and we're doing our usual thing, but this is not Star Wars related. We're talking about something else for once. But joining us as well as a special guest host on this episode is our friend and fellow podcaster and also writer for movies.com and Fandango is Mr. Chris Clow. How's it going, Chris?
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me, you guys. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for joining us. We're excited to get, a fresh face in here and, talk about some cool stuff with the latest Marvel movie that's out. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Black Panther, what'd you guys think? Let's just start with, first impressions. And I don't know. I mean, I feel like there's so much to talk about here, but just what was your initial, what were you looking for going into the movie and what was kind of your first thoughts coming out of it?
Tim, why don't you lead, man? Because for those of you listening who don't know, we all tend to game together on Xbox Live, which is a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. And I've wanted to talk to both of these guys about what they thought about Black Panther, so I'm actually kind of anxious to hear.
Yeah, so for me, I mean, it was really hard not to escape the hype that was surrounding this movie, especially if you're on Twitter a lot like I am. I mean, the buzz around this movie was a crazy high level. I mean, which is awesome, but at the same time, it's like, okay, that's great that it's getting all this good reviews. The buzz around it's good, but let's keep expectations in check. You don't want to go in with super high expectations because that's never a good thing to do for any movie. So you don't, have super high expectations and come out a little bit disappointed. So wanted to keep my expectations in check, but still really excited going into it. I mean, like I said, you couldn't escape the buzz surrounding just the good word of mouth that it was getting on early screenings and reviews. So that had me excited going into it. And, just the fact that, this is the 18th Marvel movie now, and the last one before Avengers Infinity War comes out in May. So this is almost kind of like the end of an era in a way, but at the same time, the start of a new era with Black Panther in his solo movie. So you throw that in, and plus really enjoying Black Panther and Captain America Civil War from 2 years ago, and was excited, to see him again in his own movie. So all that going into it, I was excited. And then after I left the theater, it was one of those experiences where I just couldn't help but feel, yes, this met my expectations. It lived up to the hype. I mean, it was just a really, really cool movie. And just what I loved about it, just as a general impressions, is that it felt like a comic book movie that, nothing else. It's like something that was totally different, true to the source material, though, but brought something new to the table. And you kind of hear that thrown around a lot with comic book movies that, this is something totally different and never been done before, which in some cases, yes, that's true, but maybe used a little bit too much, I think. But with this one, I think you could definitely say that. I mean, with the setting of Wakanda, the story it told, the characters, supporting characters, the villain, all of it felt so totally unique, not just for the MCU, and it stands apart from all the other MCU movies, but also connects with it really well, which is another great thing it does. But just when you look at the entire genre of comic book films, I think it's just something that is truly unique and different and just done really, really well. So yeah, I loved it coming out of it from the first time.
Well, with me, I think it was a little bit different just because for some reason, I think I was caught in something of a reverse echo chamber. It seems like it happens pretty often. Whenever a Marvel movie is getting ready to come out, there are people who scream to high heaven about how the popularity and the formula of these movies is somehow contributing to the cultural downfall of cinematic art. And
Yeah.
and although Black Panther had a little bit of that, it seems like it was minimized on the larger level. But that's kind of for whatever reason, that's kind of the rhetoric that I was hearing about it. So my expectations were basically just like, I'm pretty sure I'm gonna like it, but it didn't really have a lot of other significant external factors on top of it, if that makes sense. But I mean, I was excited anyway just because of Ryan Coogler. I loved Creed, even though I haven't really seen all that many Rocky movies. I think I've seen two. I loved Creed. I loved how reverential it was while also pushing forward a new story. And that was the only movie of his that I've seen, though. And I love Michael B. Jordan in pretty much everything that I've seen him in. And I loved Chadwick Boseman as Black Panther in Civil War. And I think he also played Jackie Robinson in that biopic that came out last year, which was also really good.
That was
Yeah,
great,
in 42.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. And so there really wasn't any negative things for me to attach onto. And I'm kind of a big superhero fan and comic book fan. So when I sat down into it and then when I walked out of the theater, I was legitimately blown away by it. The artistry that was on display with this movie, it seemed like it was aiming a little bit higher than most other Marvel movies, but it kind of goes into a class of its own. And Tim, you already mentioned Wakanda, but envisioning that place, I'd never heard of the concept of Afrofuturism before. But wow, what an embrace of that idea. It was just beautiful, absolutely beautiful to behold. The world seemed like it was so well defined. The characters were so well written. You got the sense of regality of the Wakandan royal family, but you know how sometimes you watch movies or TV shows about kings and queens, and sometimes there's parts of that that can come off as like snooty. You never got that in Black Panther, which I loved. So I mean, when I'm trying to add Black Panther into the mix of Marvel movies, the word unique doesn't seem to do it enough justice. I mean, its visual and artistic standout nature just really, really got to me. And on top of that, you had some really good nods to wider MCU continuity. I love seeing Ulysses Claw again. And, the references to things that happened in Civil War, especially at the end of the movie, as a big Captain America fan, that definitely got to me. But, and although my familiarity with Black Panther's source material is limited compared to other characters I follow, there was still enough in here for me to recognize things that I had seen before elsewhere. So overall, as a comic book movie, but also just as a movie with performances, with production design, with direction, with action, this was like a total package. I was really, really happy with it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm right there with you guys. Like, I absolutely loved it. My expectations going in was kind of like, I mean, like you guys, I heard all the positive hype in the press and everything. My personal expectations weren't like super high, but it was like, I mean, I'm not really that much of a comic book fan in general. Like, I love these movies. I love the Marvel movies. But that's kind of the scope of my I don't know, exposure to these comic book characters. I guess I'm not really a comic reader, so I don't really have any familiarity with the source material or anything like that. But I loved Black Panther and Civil War, and that was kind of my first exposure to him. And was like, okay, like I'm looking forward to seeing more of this guy. I think his solo movie is going to be pretty cool. Saw the trailers and those looked cool, but then like once you started hearing all the positive reviews, and I mean, even I didn't get to see it till like a few days after it came out, and everybody at work was talking about it and like, oh man, this movie's so cool, you got to go see it. And I still didn't like kind of let that get my personal expectations up like too high. It's not like a Star Wars movie where like if you're really engrossed in it, like your own personal expectations are already through the roof, and then it gets good reviews and you're like, oh man, now this is going to be really awesome. With Black Panther, it's kind of just like, okay, I'm definitely excited to see it, and let's just go and see why everybody else is saying it's so good. Like I was just still kind of, I wouldn't say went into it with low expectations, but kind of went in with an open mind because I didn't really know enough about it to be expecting to see certain things or really be looking for big takeaways from it. But I think honestly probably my biggest takeaway, and Chris, you were talking about this, just the the believability of the world, and just the really cool concept of sort of that the African culture with this futuristic sci-fi technology and stuff, and just making Wakanda feel like a living, breathing place with its own, realistic people, its own culture. I feel like, I love the Thor movies, but I found myself wishing that they had done the same, kind of gone into the same level of depth with Asgard as they did with Wakanda in this movie. I'm like, Wakanda almost feels like more of a realistic place after one movie than Asgard did after 3 movies.
Yeah.
Just being able to take this, totally fictional realm and make you believe like that could actually be a place, was just really cool. And like you guys were talking about, just the action, the direction, the characters, just all the stuff they go through. Just everything about it was either cool or visually striking or interesting to think about. Like, I really, aside from maybe 1 or 2 tiny little things, can't think of anything I didn't like about it. Even I think the biggest gripe that you hear people talk about is some of the CGI looking cartoony and some of like the final action scenes and stuff like that. I'm like, that didn't even really bother me that much. Probably because I was more invested in like the actual characters and what they were going through. But yeah, that definitely knocked it out of the park on all fronts. It's one of those where I went into still, even having heard all the hype and the expectations, I was like, oh wow, that kind of, like, I see now why it got all that positive press, but as far as my personal expectations, it totally blew them away. Like, it was really something special. And as far as it feeling, new and unique, among superhero movies, again, I think the world building is the biggest thing. And I feel like with a lot of these sort of, like the first solo movie for a character, you feel like, oh, that was a good introduction to the character, and it kind of maybe just scratched the surface of the world that they're from, like Asgard or something like that, or just kind of scratches the surface of who they are as a character. And I feel like somehow Black Panther managed to really dive more into it than you normally see in just like the first movie of not of a franchise, but like of a character like this. It almost felt like the first half of the movie was like just kind of the introductory setup, and then it's almost like they got like sequel level deep as far as just the characters and their motivations and stuff like that. It didn't feel like they kind of just took their time being like, oh, this will just be the introductory movie. Like, they really went for it and knocked it out of the park.
Well, that's the benefit too of being part of a shared universe. They don't necessarily have to do those kinds of first movie preliminaries, since we've already met the main character at least, and his father. So at the very least, they were able to kind of hit the ground running a little bit more in this one. And, I know people up and down the spectrum who think that the idea of a shared universe is detrimental to the creative process. But if you've seen Captain America Civil War, you have seen enough to jump into this movie with not nearly as much exposition as you would have required had he not had that appearance in that movie. And I think that's a good thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And they even show enough through like flashbacks and stuff too, that if you haven't seen Civil War, like, you still kind of get the gist of what's going on.
Exactly. Yeah. The big things to take away from Civil War is, of course, his father T'Chaka dying and him becoming the king, and they kind of recap that a little bit pretty much right in the beginning when you're reintroduced to T'Challa, and that's always something, that Marvel's done so well. But at first you're kind of wondering how it's going to work, where you introduce a new character that is going to get his own movie, but he's going to show up and have an appearance in someone else's movie, like Black Panther and Civil War. And you just can't help but think, or at least I do anyway, when that happens, is it really the right call to do that? You're introducing a character you want to build a new franchise on, but he's not going to be the focus. It's not going to be a detriment to his solo movie that comes out, but they're proving it. It works really, really well. It's great to get a little taste of what you can expect to see of Black Panther and Civil War, but then they just go full on out and telling his story in his actual own movie, which like you guys said, it works really well. Where it's great if you have seen Civil War, but at the same time, it's not something where you really have to see to get an enjoyment out of this movie. And what I really like about this movie, and going into it, I'm kind of like you guys too. I always knew of Black Panther, but I never actually read any of his main titles in Marvel Comics. I've read issues with him where he's shown up in some Avengers stories, but where I got my first exposure to Black Panther and his history with Wakanda was the animated series back in 2010, Avengers: Earth's Mightiest Heroes, which is a fantastic show. And anyone who's looking for kind of like a crash course in Marvel history on certain characters, that's the show to watch, because it'll get you introduced to the characters and the backstories in such a good way. And that's what was the case with Black Panther. And so that was the only bit of reference I had going into it. But still, I was avoiding spoilers and all that as far as plot points, big reveals, and anything like that. So I was curious to see, what the basic story was going to be for the movie, and what's going to be the motivation for the characters and the antagonists. But what really I thought worked really cool in the movie is that it's kind of tells two type of stories from the first and second half, but it all comes together for one great big story. Because I don't know about you guys, but it really felt like in the first half we were just seeing a really cool James Bond style comic book movie with a character with these cool costumes, cool gadgets, something that, is kind of unique. Again, I'm probably gonna hear that word a lot in this spoiler cast, unique. Just unique stuff to see for a comic book movie. That whole sequence in, South Korea where they're trying to get Claw, and then they have that amazing car chase, all that stuff. And you've seen the technology that they're using, and all that stuff blew me away. And before T'Challa goes out on that mission, him with his sister Shuri showing him all that cool tech, his new costumes, some of the new gadgets he can have for it. All that felt very James Bondish, but was still very cool to see, and especially when you see it in action. But then in the second half, it really felt like, a royal family Shakespeare type story, where you get, all these bombshells dropped on the royal family about having another family member who they didn't know about wanting a claim to the throne and all that. So it just they both felt very different types of movies in the first and second half, but yet it still works where it feels like a complete story that they're trying to tell here. So that was another great thing I loved about it, is just how it had these different feels, but it all came together really, really nicely for one really good story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go
I'm
ahead,
sorry.
Chris.
Well, I was just thinking that, especially with you recounting that it kind of works backwards from a typical first movie, especially for a superhero. Like take Thor, for example. You start at Asgard and you work yourself up until there's that final battle on Earth between he and the Destroyer. And with this, it's sort of like, okay, we're going to start out it starts in Wakanda largely, but we're going to start out in the world, and then we're going to funnel into a conclusion that takes place in the homeland. And it kind of plays with those expectations to a degree. And I thought that was a really cool sort of inverse on how to do a first superhero movie differently. That's all.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, Tim, I totally agree with what you were saying about how it did almost feel not quite like two separate movies, but there's a very distinct like first half and second half to the movie. Even to the point where you have Killmonger introduced pretty early on, and that was definitely like one thing that I had kind of heard all the hype and expectations about, is that, this is, definitely has one of the best and most interesting villains of any Marvel movie so far. And you get the cool introduction to him, and then he's absent for like most of the first half of the movie, to the point where I'm starting to wonder, like, hey, where is this guy? Like, what's so interesting about him? Is he just gonna like do something really cool at the end? And then when he showed up to challenge T'Challa, like back in Wakanda, I had kind of lost track of time at that point. I was like, wait, is this like the climax of the movie here? And then he, apparently kills him, and it's like, oh no, now he's gonna have to come back and sort of reclaim his throne and everything. But yeah, so you're right. Like it did definitely feel like the first and second half of the movie kind of had their own tones and their own themes going on, with the first half being just sort of more action-packed and almost more like a typical Marvel movie, and then the second half they really get into sort of more of the nitty-gritty and diving down to a deeper level of just these characters and their motivations and kind of the drama going on. And I mean, kudos to Ryan Coogler and the whole crew, because that in a lot of other movies could have felt really sort of disjointed, or felt like there were pacing issues, or like they, tried to mishmash two different kinds of movies together. But I mean, it worked more or less like really smoothly when you look at the whole thing as a whole, and the whole story just kind of works together really well. In fact, almost it's like the movie almost kind of builds it up like Ulysses Claw is going to be the main villain like in the first half, and then when Killmonger turns on him and kills him halfway through, it's like, oh dang, this guy means business.
I guess I'll say, since we're talking about Claw, and I love Andy Serkis' performance in this movie.
He just can't catch a break over the last couple months, can he?
Yeah, no, not really.
That right. Whether he's a 7-foot tall alien, an ape, or just a regular human, he just not surviving these movies. But yeah, he's got a fantastic performance, and I guess this is not really a complaint, but just kind of a really geek type of nitpick about it. I wish they kept him alive, because Ulysses Claw is one of Black Panther's main villains, and I know we were introduced to him in Age of Ultron, and we knew we were probably going to see him again in another Black Panther movie, which we obviously got. I just wish they didn't kill him off, because there's something about killing villains, let alone one who's the hero's one of his main antagonists. You kill him off in the first movie. It just, I don't know, just kind of it bothered me a little bit, as being that comic book geek. Is like, I'm sure if they would have kept him alive, they could have found another use for him. Even if not, just knowing that he's still out there, Black Panther is one of his big antagonists, is still out there, is just cool to know. So that was just a little nitpick I had, and you mix that in with a great performance by Andy Serkis. I mean, that whole again, that South Korea sequence, that would have been might be my favorite sequence of the whole movie, just for a lot of the action, the character interactions. Him talking to Everett Ross, played by Martin Freeman, was just awesome. And where he mentions about sending him the playlist and all that. It was just a lot of great dialogue, and just quirkiness to Andy Serkis' performance. The Claw was just really, really good. It was just sad to see him go.
Yeah, I'm with you, man. I mean, when it comes to superhero movies and killing their enemies, you think that this was a lesson that we learned like in the 90s, don't kill them. Then you can bring them back if you want to. I mean, I don't necessarily know if Batman and Robin would have been any better if Jack Nicholson had come back for it, but still, would have been nice to have the option. But yeah, I mean, especially considering that Claw is such a unique presence solely due to Andy Serkis's own eccentricities. Yeah, I totally agree with you on that.
Yeah, definitely. And he was such a great contrast to, Killmonger, when you have two villains kind of working side by side, but with their own sort of competing agendas. And you have one who's totally grounded in these, really sort of believable and real world issues in his backstory. And then the other guy is just a totally scene chewing, typical more comic book bad guy, but who's just a lot of fun to watch.
Oh, totally. I mean, that's kind of one of the things that I've always subscribed to with supervillains in particular. I think it was Mark Waid, one of my favorite comic book writers, who said, when you're working on a villain team up, you put all those villains in a room together, they all don't want the same thing. The thing that makes the heroes is that when you put all of them in a room together, they do all want the same thing. And you saw no greater contrast in this movie than with Killmonger and Claw, definitely.
Yeah, for sure. So speaking of villains, though, I mean, we talked about Claw. Let's talk about Killmonger for a second. What did you guys, like about him or dislike, if anything? And just what do you think makes him just so unique among, Marvel villains that's really kind of striking a chord with people?
Yeah, so with Killmonger, that was another one of the things that couldn't escape the hype about it, as far as saying, oh, this is easily Marvel's best villain since Loki. Like, Marvel finally has a good villain, which I never fully bought into that whole thing of Marvel villains all being bad and underused. I think it's depends on the movies. It's, depends on the varying degrees to which I think you can make that argument. But it definitely wasn't the case with Killmonger, like everyone's saying. Michael B. Jordan was great in the role, and my only complaint about it is what you said earlier, Kyle, was how there was that portion of the first half of the movie where you're just wondering, man, where is he? Like, you've heard good things about him, but he hasn't showed up in a while. And it just makes me wonder, is it going to feel rushed at the end where he shows up again and he starts, showing us and telling us what his motivations and plans are? But it didn't feel rushed, but at the same time, I don't think it quite reached the level of greatness that his villain could have if he was in it a little bit more. I just think if he had a few more scenes with him kind of early on in the movie, I think it would have helped, elevate that character and help us, not necessarily, appreciate more what they're trying to say, but I think it just helps in general when you're spending more time with a villain who's, is a complex character who's raising some, interesting questions, which, for a villain, you're not always typically, the villain's evil and you're not going to agree with his plans. But with Killmonger, he makes some interesting points where maybe you start to, realize that, he's not too far off here, even though he's doing things or going about it a totally wrong way. And you still got that feeling. But I just think he could have been top tier comic book movie villains if we just spent a little bit more time with him, in my opinion. But he's definitely one of the best in the MCUs, and Michael B. Jordan gives a great performance on it. And one of the things that caught me by surprise, which again added to the character, what makes you, kind of appreciate what they were going for and how kind of feel what his motivations are, was that it kind of took me by surprise. I don't know if it did for you guys, was that it was revealed he was the little kid playing basketball court when, T'Chaka was there to come get his brother, but he ends up killing him. I just personally thought, it's just kids playing in the neighborhood and they're wondering what's going on as they see this light in the sky. That's their ship. And, that would be the end of it. But it turns out that was actually, T'Chaka's nephew. And that just, added more to, why he would do what his plans are in this movie. So I didn't see that one coming. And that's kind of what helped me appreciate, and kind of let go of how he wasn't really focused on in the beginning of the movie, but getting that backstory and where he came from kind of helped, fill in that gap a little bit, and just to really get into his motivations and what he was trying to accomplish here and why he wanted to go to Wakanda, challenge T'Challa for the throne and all that stuff. So in the end, it all worked out for a great character and a great antagonist for Black Panther. But that was just one thing I was, contemplating as I was watching the movie, is just, when is he going to show up again? But it all worked out in the end.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the sign of a good villain, at least to me, has always been a degree of understanding, a degree of relatability. I mean, there's some villains, that just want to watch the world burn, and that's why they function, right?
Mm-hmm.
But most of the time, you should probably at least partially understand and even potentially empathize with where a villain is coming from. And anyone with an ounce of empathy in their blood can at least partially understand every single thing that Killmonger is saying and where he is coming from. How can you not have empathy for his perspective on wanting to provide freedom for oppressed peoples, people that look like him? How can you not? How can your heart not bleed at least a little bit for that? But the contrast, the brilliance of this movie is that the contrast between hero and villain is that it's the unrestrained passion on one side, sort of a populist approach, like I want to do this, I want to change the world. But the methods are wrong. He wants to change the world by force. He wants to change the world potentially by destruction and subjugation. And the responsibility that T'Challa knows that he has is in restraint. It's in leadership. It's in trying to find a better way for other people. And that's one of the things that I just absolutely love this movie for, is that the conflict is extraordinarily understandable from both of their perspectives. T'Challa's coming into the throne. He's trying to set an example for his people. But, here comes Killmonger. He wants to take the throne away. And there are people within the kingdom who agree with him, who think we've stood on the sidelines for far too long. There is more that we can do. And maybe this is the best way to do more. And T'Challa has to come in and say, there's a reason why we haven't done this. You don't upset the social order like this. You don't turn the world on its head just because your emotions are inflamed. You have to be, if we're going to be technological leaders of the world, if we are going to take that step, then we have to lead by example. And T'Challa taking that kind of perspective was just brilliant. And it showed, again, such a deep contrast, even though, at the end of the day, even T'Challa related to what Killmonger was saying, but he knew that it was the methods that were wrong. And I love that about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, Chris, I think you hit it right on the head when you're talking about the relatability of the villain. I think to me that was definitely what made Killmonger so great, was like, we've had villains before where you can kind of relate to them in one way or another, especially if there's, some tragic thing in their backstory that, you feel sympathy for them, or you can understand why they're doing what they're doing. But I think Killmonger kind of has two very distinct layers to him that are both very relatable. Like, on the one hand, you have the fact, his backstory that we learned through these flashbacks and stuff about him being related to the royal family, and the fact that, his father was killed by T'Challa's father, way back when. And that, even though, I think he was kind of like a spy or something, right? Like, he was one of these emissaries from Wakanda that's, placed out in the real world. And with his father dead, he was just kind of left to grow up on the streets by himself. And so he was, he should have been, sort of an heir apparent, I guess, to, if not to the throne of Wakanda, then at least to be able to grow up there and to, experience the benefits of that. But instead, he was just kind of left to his own devices, and, struggled a lot more than he felt he should have. And, so like that was tragic, and, in and of itself, just a pretty good backstory for a villain that kind of makes you be able to sympathize for them. And then on the flip side, you also have just his motivations for doing what he wants to do. And like you were talking about, just sort of his idea that was kind of radical among the people of Wakanda, that like, hey, there's people like us out in the world that are suffering, horrible injustices, and I've seen it, I've grown up in it, and we have the power to, empower these people and help them to kind of dig their way out of this hole that they're in by, sharing our technological advances and our culture with the rest of the world. But of course, the thing that still clearly delineates him as a villain is when he starts talking about like, fight back against the oppressors and kill their women, kill their children. It's like, oh, okay, this guy's still a bad guy. Like, I was almost worried at first, like when he first starts talking about some of this kind of stuff, I'm like, are we supposed to be on his side? And then, a few minutes later, you're like, oh, no, he's still psycho. But
wait a minute, man.
Yeah. But so I just feel like there's kind of, those two sides to him. And I feel like either one of those would have made for a decent villain by itself. And when you layer those two on top of each other, it just makes him such a sort of compelling character, and one that you like almost want to root for. And it's like, man, you could have been the hero of this story if you just like didn't have such a bloodlust about you. Yeah. But the thing that I love too about the way that his story kind of relates to T'Challa's, and I think one that sort of cements his legacy as a really interesting villain, is the fact that, at the beginning of the movie, like T'Challa kind of just wants to keep the status quo, right? Like this is, and he has a very interesting character arc for, for one of these heroes in their first standalone movie, because typically it's about the hero trying to achieve something greater. Like, the first Iron Man is about him becoming Iron Man. Like the first Thor, like he wants to be king of Asgard, and instead he gets cast down and he's trying to reclaim his honor. To start off Black Panther, like T'Challa's not really trying to gain anything, or he's not trying to change himself. Like he's like at the very start of the movie, we see him become king. So he's already got the thing that like most other people want. And it's something that was sort of thrust upon him, like because his father was killed, he wasn't, gunning for the throne or anything like that. But of course he accepts that responsibility, and all he really wants to do is be a good king and, keep, obviously Wakanda prospered under his father, and he just wants to keep the good thing going. And then Killmonger comes along and shakes things up, and I think really kind of changes T'Challa's perspective on this, so that by the end of the movie, he's like, he defeats the villain, but he's like, you know what? That guy maybe had a point, and obviously I'm going to not go about it the way that he wanted to, and, just murder people and like ship out weapons everywhere in the world and let people just start, anarchy essentially. But, I liked that that there was part of the villain's ideology that the hero ended up adopting, and was like, you know what, even though that guy was, wrong to be doing the things he did, and I defeated him because I had to, for the betterment of, myself and my people and whatever, for him to be, sort of humble enough to learn that lesson and be like, you know what, this guy did have a good point about us, using our wealth and our knowledge and our technology to do more to help people in the world around us, and see him, sort of open himself up to that by the end of the movie, I thought was really cool. And it's almost like, that to have a villainous character leave a positive impact on the hero like that, I think is something that is, really not something you see a lot.
No, yeah. I mean, like what you guys are saying about the contrast between those two characters, and how we're kind of saying to ourselves about Killmonger, about, he kind of has a point. As you were saying, Kyle, should I be rooting for this guy? But in the end, you don't. It was kind of almost the opposite in a way about T'Challa, where it's not that you're rooting against him at any point in the movie, but you're kind of, in the same shoes as Lupita Nyong'o's character, Nakia, where just trying to have him and Wakanda as a nation just reach out to those in needs in like relief efforts and helping out those who need the help. But, the total opposite way that Killmonger wants to go about things, but making Wakanda known to help and do, be part of the greater good in the world. So it's kind of like you were going, come on, T'Challa, yeah, listen to her, and kind of take that to heart, where maybe that is something you would need to do as like the new king of Wakanda to, kind of bring about this new era for the nation. So it's great how they both had that contrast when we're seeing these two characters and their arcs play out. And then by the time we get to the final fight, and once, T'Challa does defeat Killmonger, and this is probably another fantastic moment in the movie where T'Challa, does feel for Killmonger what he went through. And like you said, Kyle, kind of brings him about to understand himself that he probably does need to do more to help those who need the help that aren't able to help themselves. And that really touching moment where he brings up Killmonger to see the sunset of Wakanda before he dies, as that's what his father always wanted to bring him to Wakanda to see. And then I was just thinking to myself as I was watching this, I wonder if T'Challa's gonna offer to save Killmonger. I mean, they obviously have the technology to do that in Wakanda. It's gonna be no problem, and he does offer that to save him. But man, Killmonger's response was really powerful. Where this goes, he refuses it, saying, just to live the rest of my life as a prisoner. No, and I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but then he says, I'd rather die like my ancestors who jumped ship rather than live as slaves. I mean, those are his last words. And this is very powerful. Just, kind of cemented that character and everything that he's been through, and just his reasoning for doing things that, you can understand why. So it just all culminated into a great moment for both characters.
Yeah, and what an interesting and poignant and actually kind of beautiful way to end that conflict, right? I mean, here's one of the probably one of the most visceral one-on-one fights that we've seen in the MCU. Maybe, I mean, it might take the cake, maybe second only to that last phase of Cap versus Iron Man in Civil War, where it was just like blood, sweat, and tears. Yeah. And to end on a shared moment of reflection on a beautiful sunset was something that was really cool. And then, of course, Killmonger takes the, I guess, the reverential wind out of the sails to a degree with his last words. But those last words absolutely do leave an impression. And you can't necessarily say that his perspective is wrong, but it is harsh. And just like his life has been harsh, and that's the way that he died as he lived, basically. But I was really, really taken with the way that conflict played out, and especially with how it ended, because those kinds of shared moments of reflection and understanding between hero and villain don't come around as often as the genre could probably use. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, it's funny, like, as totally separate universe and tangent right here, but it almost made me think of Star Wars Rebels with the finale between Obi-Wan and Maul. And I'm probably just thinking of that because the finale of Star Wars Rebels is like airing right now as we're recording this, and I'm sure we're all anxious to go watch that as soon as we're done here. But yeah, just those moments of like you were saying, just sort of that shared connection between the hero and villain, where the fight is over and it's like, look, I don't want to kill you anymore. Like, what can we do for you? And just sort of recognizing what they have in common. Is always cool to see. And then, of course, that last line by Killmonger was really powerful. And obviously, I mean, there's so much to his motivations and his backstory that's sort of culturally relevant right now with all the, the police brutality and all this stuff that you hear about going on, and stuff that just when you hear some of the stuff he's talking about and the motivations for his character, it's like, yeah, they should do something about that, but just not to the extreme that he wants to go. So
Right.
it was cool to see, again, like I said, just cool to see T'Challa kind of pick and choose, like take the good bits of what Killmonger was trying to get at and adopt that for himself.
No, definitely. I mean, we're talking about Killmonger a lot, and T'Challa is in contrast to his arc and his, but just from the start, if I can shift gears a little bit to T'Challa, where his story begins, and just how I like how you brought out, Kyle, earlier, that he's not really trying to gain anything at the start of this movie. He's just accepting his new role as king and what he's going to do. But I just love how it all started in the beginning once we're reintroduced to him and he comes into Wakanda. I mean, that was one of those concepts of the Black Panther history and mythos that I knew beforehand, thanks to the Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes animated series, of how, those who can challenge the throne in combat. And I kind of, as I said earlier, I was avoiding spoilers, but I kind of knew that would be probably something we would see. I didn't know we'd get it twice, so that was an added bonus. But I thought it was cool how, we saw the whole process of, what it is to become the king of Wakanda. And we have that ceremony where T'Challa has to take on M'Baku, the man-ape, who challenges him for the throne. And it's just visually just a cool scenario and, sequence to take place on, like the mountaintop and the waterfall, and you got all of these different tribes there making their presence known, acknowledging T'Challa's rule as king, and if anyone wants to challenge, is like M'Baku does. And just seeing it play out was really awesome. And something that I didn't know would happen too, but I thought was a really cool thing that they did for T'Challa, is to have it strip away the powers of the Black Panther for those fights, to make it really, like, you really have to earn the right to be king in the Black Panther without relying on its powers and strength. So that was cool that was something they brought into it for him to take on whoever challenges him. So there was I thought both fight sequences were cool, but at the same time it built off one another. Like the first one was M'Baku, wasn't quite as brutal as it was when T'Challa had to face Killmonger later on, which was a much more brutal fight that he had to go through. Mm-hmm. But they were both really cool sequences, and some, like I said, that I knew of Black Panther's lore that I was hoping to see in the movie, and I think they delivered on that front. And just the whole, sequences and events that led up to, in the process of him becoming king, I thought were really cool, because after he wins the fight with M'Baku, he gets that moment where they have to bury him in the sand, and he goes to that spiritual plane. And I just visually love that whole, spirit realm where it has, the dark lighting, the purple lighting, and he sees, the kings of old in panther form before he meets his father. So I loved all that stuff. So that whole introduction to T'Challa and him becoming king, I thought was really cool.
Yeah, that first fight scene I felt like really helped set the stage and let you know that this movie was going to be something different and something special, because I mean, the action was really cool, just the way that the fight played out, but also just the scenery, the music, seeing all the different Wakandan tribes there, like, to participate in this ritual, and seeing, just the costumes, the way that the people and the culture were portrayed. Like, I feel like that scene like really wrapped up kind of the essence of what this movie was, in terms of just all the sort of new stuff that it brought to the table. I just remember sitting there thinking, like, on the one hand, just the fight itself was really cool, but just the whole way that scene was set up, I felt like was kind of the first thing in the movie that really let you know, like, okay, we're in for something new and different and really special here.
Well, and Boseman anchors things so well, because this is a big cast, and this is a cast full of people. I mean, there's more than one Academy Award winner in this cast. Yeah. So that fact in and of itself, to have Boseman's resolve and really, I know I said it before, but that kind of kingly regality, he very clearly shows up as a leader in this movie. And it's a credit to its casting. I mean, he embodies T'Challa so well. It's kind of impossible to imagine anyone stepping into that role so perfectly. I mean, really the only better or equal comic book casting that I can think of is probably Hugh Jackman. I mean, he seems to fit Black Panther to a T, but also I think one of the other things that sort of amplifies the impact of the fights and the overall realism, like you mentioned before, Kyle, is the look of the world, and it's just so beautifully realized and so beautifully photographed. I mean, you can sort of see influences with other African nations, but obviously Wakanda's advancement makes it far and away, quasi-futuristic. But it still manages to feel, like you said at the beginning of the show again, Kyle, is like a place you could maybe go to. Like it has enough rooted in reality that it sort of amplifies the stakes of everything. Because if you don't feel like your hero is fighting for something real, then sometimes the stakes can get lost in the message that the movie's trying to push forward. And one of the reasons I don't think that happens here is because that world is so beautifully realized and has that sort of truthfulness to it that it's not even a factor that I can necessarily put my finger on specifically. But I mean, all of those factors combined with Boseman's performance really does help push this movie forward in an awesome way and in a very interesting way too.
Well, I think one thing that I think really does help ground it in the way you were talking about, and I think we can kind of use this to segue from talking about just Black Panther and Killmonger to some of the other supporting cast that were all phenomenal. The fact that Wakanda is obviously a totally fictional place, but the fact that in the story, like, it's in Africa, like it's on our planet, this is not like Asgard or any of the planets from Guardians of the Galaxy or Thor Ragnarok or anything like that. It's like the actors don't have to act like they're from a completely different place. Like having this fictional technologically advanced nation that's just hiding in the middle of the African jungle, like all the actors can just play like they're African warriors and kings and stuff like that, and they don't have to be like, well, what would they act like if they were from a far off realm or a different planet or something like that. Because I think more than just the look of the world and stuff, I feel like the performances of all the cast members, I think, is really what really kind of nailed it down and solidified just the believability of it. I mean, first of all, like when you were talking about Chadwick Boseman, I think you just made a good point about how well he sort of anchors the cast, despite the fact that he's not as big of a presence, if that makes sense, as like some of the other Marvel characters. I mean, for example, like if Iron Man was the main character in this movie, he'd steal this, he would steal the movie because that's what Tony Stark does, right? Like he just has that kind of personality where he's got to be the loudest and most noticeable guy in the room. Or Thor, who has, just sort of the big presence and bravado and whatever.
You know what part in the movie perfectly illustrates what you're saying? Is when his sister is showing him those suit designs, right? And he chooses the one that's as nondescript as possible. Right. Because he doesn't want to stand out. And then what's the suit that Killmonger chooses at the end?
Yeah.
I mean,
flashy.
Exactly, because he's not that kind of person who will step into a spotlight. Exactly like you're saying.
Yeah, and I mean, I think he's definitely more of like the strong, silent type, and not the Tony Stark step into the spotlight type. But at the same time, I feel like for a different actor, it might have been easy to just sort of get lost in that and let some of the other just some of the great performances from some of the supporting actors take over and be like, oh, make T'Challa not that interesting. But I think Chadwick Boseman just strikes that perfect balance of having him, again, feel kind of subdued and feel like the strong silent type, like the king that just wants to lead by example and just do the right thing and doesn't have, huge ambitions or isn't, a big loud personality or anything like that. But at the same time, like, you believe that like he's in charge, like he's the king. This isn't somebody else's movie. But I mean, aside from that, just all the supporting cast was freaking amazing. And I think that's one other thing that makes this movie stand out. from, you know, some of his peers. Like, I can't think of another Marvel movie or even another superhero movie, aside from maybe like some of the Nolan Batman movies, where so many of the supporting cast was memorable.
Sure.
You know, like I think the general consensus, it seems like almost everybody's favorite character in the movie was his sister, Zuri, or Shuri. Shuri. I think that's
Shuri.
it. I can't remember the names of all these characters, but I mean, she was awesome. The general, you know, of his like royal guard, that's played by the lady from The Walking Dead, with the spear and everything. She was freaking awesome.
Okoye.
Lupita Nyong'o was fantastic. Even Martin Freeman, like, I wasn't expecting him to get to do as much as he did, especially early on when he was just kind of like the you know, the sidekick guy. I mean, it was kind of funny to see them flip the script and have like a token white guy in a black cast for once. But yeah, at first it was just like, oh, he's kind of here to just be like the agent guy that ties this to the rest of the larger MCU. Like, you know, if this was a Phase 1 Marvel movie, you know, this totally would have been Coulson. But then at the end, it's like, oh, you actually get to see him kind of use his piloting skills and see that, oh, he's not just there to talk and do diplomacy and stuff, but to see him actually get to take part in the action. That was pretty cool too. And then of course you got Forrest Whitaker, you know, seeing Saw Gerrera in there helping out, Black Panther was pretty cool. Just, man, this whole,
Well, that's what happened to him after Jeddah.
yeah. But man, just, yeah, top to bottom, I felt like all the supporting cast did an amazing job of just making all these characters feel real and believable, and just fleshing out this world and making it feel interesting and lived in.
No, yeah, I totally agree. I mean, this probably is one of the best, if not the best, overall supporting cast for an MCU film or comic book movie, because pretty much just like all of them. I mean, there's not one, because certain movies, you know, when there's supporting characters, you can go, okay, they're kind of, you know, in there for comic relief, it's not really working, or, you know, this character seems wasted, they don't have much to do. But every one of these characters served a purpose and just had great moments. I mean, you know, like you mentioned his sister Shuri. I mean, she had a lot of great moments in the movie, but my favorite is still was him and her showing off her tech and the new costumes that she developed for him. And probably one of the funniest moments is where she's having him test the strength of the new costume, where first he kicks it, you know, across the room, but then she starts to film. He goes, "Why are you filming?" She's like, "Just kick it again." And he has that force field and knocks him backwards. He's like, "You're deleting that."
And then of course what are those?
Yeah.
No, I mean,
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
well, just gonna echo what you guys are saying, though. I mean, the supporting cast, you know, it's one thing to put a bunch of characters out there and then just kind of hope for the best, but really the strength of this cast is with the caliber of actors that were chosen. And I mean, you have a lot of recognizable people, sure, but there's a camaraderie here that you can't fake. You know, the story does a really good job of tying everybody together, but it seems like all of these performers have a really good into how this world is going to be constructed. They're invested in this movie. They definitely wanted it to work, and because of that, it does. And I don't know how you could come out of this without forming like pretty specific opinions on a pretty surprisingly wide swath of the supporting cast. This was one of the best supporting casts that I've seen in a superhero movie, bar none. And that's in no small part due to the performances. They were just great.
Yeah, I think, you know, the performances, as well as also obviously the writing, and just sort of giving everyone a role in the story that just kind of worked. Like,
oh yeah,
and I guess finding a way to give all of them something interesting to do, to make all of them memorable. Because I mean, like we were saying, like with a lot of these movies, you have a lot of supporting characters, and maybe a couple of them stand out, like, oh, that guy was really funny, or that girl had some cool action scenes, or whatever. But yeah, like, especially within the MCU, like, I can't think of another movie aside from like the Avengers movies and Civil War where the entire cast was that memorable. And it's certainly like it just goes above and beyond, because I feel like if any of the characters were less memorable, it wouldn't necessarily be like a criticism against the movie, because you don't generally expect there to be that many sort of that many characters that stand out as much as they do. I mean, even you think about like the flashbacks with Killmonger's dad and him kind of being turned on by T'Challa's father and Zuri back when they were younger. Like, even those performances are really memorable. And like, I mean, I've only seen the movie once so far, and I really want to get out and see it again. I just haven't had the time yet, but I can still remember just, the faces of those characters and just specific moments that they all had. And, again, it's not like, oh, well, good, because like the movie would have been, wouldn't have lived up to my expectations if any of these guys had, kind of fallen short. It's just like, man, that was really impressive that they managed to develop all these characters, make them all relatable in some way or another without making it feel overcrowded. Like, it didn't feel like it took away from the main narrative, or I don't feel like T'Challa was, less well developed because they spent so much time working on the supporting cast. Like, I mean, it's, they just managed to fit all those puzzle pieces together really well to be able to develop everybody that much, show off that much cool action and stuff, like between T'Challa and again, I'm blanking on some of the characters' names, but like Lupita Nyong'o and the general lady and his sister, and like they all had their part to play, and they all got to do some really cool stuff, and all kind of had their moment to shine. And to do all of that without making it feel overcrowded, or without making the movie too long, or without making it feel like, oh, well, there was this one character who should have been important but just like didn't get as much to do because they were spending so much time on everybody else. Like, it's really rare to find that. And I just, applaud them for utilizing the cast and the characters so well in that way.
No, yeah, you nailed it, because what I was thinking about as you were talking about, how great the supporting cast is and how it wouldn't be a criticism if they weren't, but that's just what helps. The fact that they are great is what helps elevate this movie, above some of the other comic book films that we've gotten over the last few years, and puts it up, near the top as one of the best ones, because the supporting cast is so strong. And the reason why I probably would call it one of the best, if not the best supporting cast, is because when you compare it to, like the Avengers and Guardians of the Galaxy, that's more, of an ensemble cast of main characters, that all got to work together to, support the story that they're trying to tell with them. But with Black Panther, this is his movie, and of course it's going to be his story. But, you got, when he's surrounded by all these supporting characters, that just makes it even better. And it's kind of weird. I don't know if I'm going to explain it right, but you were saying how it doesn't take away from T'Challa or Chadwick Boseman's performance and how it's still Black Panther's movie. That's totally the case. They don't. But at the same time, these supporting characters were so good and memorable that you think about them a lot too, as you would the main character of the movie. When most of the time, when, like I said, Iron Man, Captain America, or Thor movie, those characters, the main ones, leave the impression on you. But with Black Panther, you had some additional characters to go along with T'Challa, that the ones who are memorable and stick with you after you see it, which again is what helps make this movie so good.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about Everett Ross for a second, I've heard a lot of people say that, well, he was just there as window dressing, or that he wasn't really there to do much. I mean, first of all, Everett Ross does have a functional place in Black Panther's direct supporting cast. He was created, I think, in 1998. Christopher Priest, who did a long run on Black Panther, created Everett Ross. It wasn't in a Black Panther book that he first appeared in, but he was widely utilized as a Black Panther supporting character. And I'll say this much: he certainly had much more to do in this movie than he did in Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, his place in Civil War was probably, it could probably be relatively accurately characterized as a sort of a glorified cameo. Like, hey, look, Everett Ross is here, so maybe that means that he's going to be a Black Panther supporting character. And yeah, I was actually really happy with the way that turned out. But that's obviously just one example of this really great cast. I mean, Letitia Wright, like you guys have said, who played his younger sister, her joy was infectious. You felt she was almost like the emotional barometer of the entire movie. Like, she was clued in at specific points in the story with how the audience was feeling at that point. And that's not a common thing to find. I mean, there are people and characters and actors who try to be that, but they don't succeed for one reason or another. But she is just dialed in. And then Denai Gurira, who played Michonne on The Walking Dead, who plays Okoye?
Yeah. Okoye, I think is how they pronounce it.
She was probably one of my absolutely favorite supporting characters.
I agree. Yep.
I mean, you do not screw around with her. And I loved her. I loved in the South Korea scene, you know, she hated wearing that dress and she was just annoyed.
Wig,
yeah. She was just annoyed as all get out about it. And then when the time came for her to do her work, there was just like this freedom that she automatically seemed to feel as she was getting ready to do what she was there to do. And how could you not love Lupita Nyong'o as Nakia? I mean, it's sometimes you look at a romance, particularly in a superhero movie or a general comics movie, and it can be sort of easy to glaze your eyes over a little bit. It's like, okay, well, this has to be in here. But it wasn't that. I mean, both Nakia and T'Challa, they came from, obviously they had a long history together, but there was something that felt really sweet and authentic about this particular pairing. And I love the way that it was resolved. I mean, the Black Panther comics that I've read the most were probably Reginald Hudlin's, and he was writing an ongoing Black Panther series during the Civil War event back in 2006. And in those books, Black Panther ended up with Storm, and she actually became the Queen of Wakanda. I would like to see that, sure, but I'd also love a solid gold toilet seat. But I mean, for what we have, and Nakia does have a presence in the source material, I'm not as familiar with it, but I really love the way that these characters were functional. And I mean, obviously reverential to what's come in the comics before, but also very truthful for the movie that they were making. I can't say enough good things about the supporting cast, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, they all felt just so authentic, and again, like Ryan Coogler and the whole crew just put like an extra layer of effort into making them really just sort of believable and relatable. Because if you look at them on the surface, like Shuri could have easily just been the comic relief, little sister that's there to kind of jab him in the ribs and make jokes. And, Nakia could have been the cookie cutter love interest, and Okoye could have been the, awesome general lady who's got no character development, but just has some really cool fight scenes. But the fact that they sort of fulfilled all those just sort of archetypes, and then they took it a step further and made all those characters memorable and relatable, and, a cut above just sort of the typical role that you might fill in any other superhero movie, I think is, really just sort of speaks to, the strength of this movie and its characters. So absolutely loved like all of those guys.
Yep, totally agree.
Definitely.
So aside from that, I'm trying to think, is there anything that we haven't hit on? Any, I don't know, just any points, anything you guys liked or didn't like about the movie that we haven't mentioned yet?
Yeah. One thing that I think I really appreciated was that its connectivity to the wider universe was definitely present, but it wasn't overriding. Because that obviously there's a benefit and a detriment to a wider shared universe narrative that the MCU has been weaving now for 10 years. And sometimes it can beat you over the head with it, or there are movies that are designed to be full on extensions of that. As much as I loved Captain America Civil War, part of me is a little bit impatient when I watch that movie, because it is so it concerns itself with being so connected to the wider narrative. I think the movie that suffers the worst from that in the entire MCU is probably Iron Man 2, just because they're throwing out so many hints for what's coming, and that really gets aggravating after a while. Civil War, at the end of the day, is still an eminently watchable movie, and I love that movie to death. Iron Man 2 is one where I'm like, do I really need to watch that again? But with Black Panther, it's a little bit different, because yes, it reacts to a really, really consequential event that happened in Civil War, but it takes that basis of that important event that you probably saw in glorified Avengers 2.5 and runs with it to tell something that's wholly unique and fully owned by this main character. So obviously it's not quite as disconnected, I guess, or standalone as something like Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, which was pretty much doing its own thing from beginning to end. But this is the right way, I think, to do shared universe interaction. And I was really, really satisfied with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and as you're mentioning that, Chris, I mean, I don't know about you guys when you're watching it, but this is what I love about it being a shared universe. It can, a movie like Black Panther, it can be on its own and not have a lot of connectivity as some other MCU movies. But the fact that it's still a part of it is just so cool. I mean, at certain points I'm watching it, like when we get that grand introduction into Wakanda, we see how cool it looks. I just can't help but think to myself, how awesome that this is in the same universe where Black Panther is becoming king here in Wakanda. The Guardians of the Galaxies are out, going to whatever planets they're traveling to right now. And then you got, Iron Man doing his own thing, Captain America doing his own thing. And it's all connected together. Even if you want to go further, like I do, and watch the TV shows like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Netflix, and you think about, Daredevil's off doing his own thing, and Hell's Kitchen, it's all in the same universe. I just love that about the MCU, that we have all these different parts of it, but they're all, part of the same world and universe. I just geek out so much when I think about it, when I see a new movie that is as good and different as Black Panther, when it's adding to that universe. It's just such a cool feeling.
And the cool thing about that is that it's all funneling into one thing next month.
Yeah,
next month.
We can say next month.
Oh,
now.
yeah.
That's
wow.
crazy.
Yeah, no, I definitely would say I'm even more excited for Infinity War after this movie. But yeah, just real quick, I mean, to piggyback off what you guys were saying, just totally agree about the whole, the way that this fits into the MCU, because it feels like, I mean, obviously that connective tissue is there, especially with, Everett Ross and with the connections to, events that happened in Civil War, and even with Age of Ultron, like when you've got Ulysses Claw still in there. But it definitely feels like it's not trying to just shoehorn itself in and be like, okay, where can we fit this within the MCU as we know it? But instead it's building on, like, it's like an MCU expansion pack or something like that. Like it's adding an extra section to the world and then connecting it to the stuff that we already know. But it's not just like, I don't know. I like the way that it adds a lot of new stuff and lets you kind of just explore that without being like, oh, here's where it fits in the timeline or in the world, or, just jamming all this stuff down your throat. So I thought that was really well done. But then, yeah, I mean, like you guys were talking about, we got Infinity War coming up in less than 2 months now, because in case anyone missed it, they just recently announced that they're moving up the release date of that movie to April 27th now.
Yep.
As opposed to May 4th when it was before. And I guess it was coming out in like the UK and some other countries on April 27th. And it was just going to be a week ahead of when we were going to get it here in the US. And now everyone around the world is going to get to see it all at the same time. So that'll be pretty awesome. And then, of course, if you watch the trailer for Civil War, it seems like a big part of that movie, or at least what they chose to show us in the trailer, there was kind of a big focus on Wakanda, which at the time, I guess when I first saw the Civil War, or the trailer for Infinity War, I was like, man, this looks really cool, but like, I don't really know what's going on with the stuff in Wakanda, because like, I haven't seen that movie yet. And now, of course, that we've seen Black Panther, and we, have a much more better idea of like what's going on in Wakanda and who all these characters are, and have a much deeper connection to that part of the universe now. Now I'm just like, oh man, let's see those guys kick Thanos out of there. Come on, let's go.
Yep. I guess that's the one last thing I'll mention too, is how cool I thought the final action sequence was, because going into it just from the trailers, you knew Black Panther was going to fight Killmonger, and that would probably be the crux of it. But the fact that we had, some of the tribes fighting against each other, his Dora Milaje fighting against, I think Wakabi and his tribe, and then he's throwing the rhinos in there. It just made for a completely, totally unexpected action sequence in the film, but also really cool. I mean, how awesome was it seeing Black Panther, take down that rhino like non-lethally?
Oh my
God.
That was so awesome. So it was definitely a surprising but yet really cool final action sequence.
Yeah, that was one heck of a final battle. That, I mean, like you, Tim, I was not expecting. I mean, I knew we were going to get, some cool action and stuff from the movie, but just when you get to that last scene, I was like, whoa, I did not know we were getting a full-scale battle here. And I love that. I had seen like a couple days before I saw the movie, I saw a post from somebody on Facebook saying like, It said Black Panther spoilers, but without any context, and it was just like a video of a baby rhino at a zoo, like charging across its pen. And I was like, okay, I don't know what that means. And then I kind of had a chuckle at that when I actually saw that part of the movie.
That's funny. Yeah, I mean, and not to dog on so many of the other MCU movies, but I mean, one of the biggest criticisms I think of the ends of both of the Avengers movies was that, you know, it's Avengers versus two giant faceless enemies, right? I mean, the faceless enemies basically just exist for the Avengers to do cool things, and that's exactly what they did. But when you compare, let's say, those fights with what we saw here, I mean, you get to know the leaders of both of the sides of this conflict. Mm-hmm. And it was way more emotional than I was expecting it to be. So I was very, very pleasantly surprised with that. And just, you know, rhinos. That's awesome.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I think we've pretty much hit on everything there is to talk about. Is there anything else you guys wanted to mention before we wrap up here?
No, I think I'm good.
Yeah, I mean, just such a really great addition to the MCU and just into the comic book movie genre in general. Just so much great stuff about it, from character development, story, world building, action sequences. Just what's not to love about it besides a few little nitpicks here and there that I had, which you're going to get in most movies anyway. So yeah, it was just awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely wasn't perfect, but it was a great movie. I would say, I mean, I would probably place it within my top 5 Marvel movies, at least, if not higher. I'm actually going through with some friends, and we're doing like a weekly rewatch of all the MCU movies right now, and there's so many of them that I haven't seen in a long time, so it's hard for me to know exactly like what my order would be.
But wanted to do that too, but you know what, I find it's hard to do, at least for me and my schedule anyway, for an MCU rewatch, because it would probably be one a week. But at the same time, during that rewatch, now we're about to 17 movies to have on Blu-ray now with Thor Ragnarok, is that there's either going to be a new Marvel movie coming out that you would have to see that would disrupt your order that you're seeing it in, or a new movie will come out on Blu-ray that you want to watch right away that will disrupt your order. And so I was like,
Thor Ragnarok in stores now.
Exactly. Like I could be on Iron Man 3 right now, but I've got to pop in Thor Ragnarok because I want to see that.
Yeah, you gotta plan your MCU rewatches like at least 3 or 4 months in advance, maybe longer than that.
Oh yeah, no, we've been doing this since the beginning of the year.
Okay, perfect.
Because I think originally, and I don't know if this is going to get screwed up now by the fact that they changed the release date for Infinity War, but I think somebody figured out that if you watched one Marvel movie a week from the beginning of this year, you'd be done like the week before Infinity War came out. So I don't know if we're going to have to like double up now with the release date being pushed up. But yeah, we just watched, what was it? Not Iron Man 3. No, we just watched Winter Soldier last week, and then this week we're going to watch Guardians of the Galaxy.
Perfect. Oh man, yeah, I wish I could fit it. I wish I had the foresight that you guys had, because I would love to rewatch everything ahead of time. But maybe that's maybe after Infinity War, maybe before Ant-Man and the Wasp.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm kind of the same boat, Chris. That was my plan, but it got ruined or got disrupted, like I said, by other stuff where I had to miss a week or whatnot. But
right.
Maybe when Infinity War comes out on Blu-ray, that would be
there.
The
you
time.
go.
Yeah, there you go.
Time it now so that when you get to Infinity War, you will have it on your shelf.
Yes,
like that's the day that you bring it home.
Hey, yeah, there you go.
But as far as right now to see it in theaters, I'll probably just end up watching some of my favorite MCU movies that will probably have a little bit of tie-in. At least almost every character from the MCU movie is going to be in Infinity War, so at least watch at least one that has a character that's going to be in the Infinity War movie. That'll probably be my plan now.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, good stuff. Definitely, glad to see we all enjoyed this movie a whole lot. Hopefully you guys did too that are listening to this, and hope you've enjoyed our commentary on it. So I think we're just about ready to wrap up here. Chris, thanks so much for joining us. Great to have you on here. And why don't you go ahead and tell everybody where they can find you on the internet and whatever podcasts and stuff you're involved with.
Absolutely. And thank you again for the invitation. I really appreciate it. I love having any chance to talk with cool people about things that I also think are cool. So much appreciated.
Thanks.
You can find me on Twitter at Chris Clow, ChrisClow. I'm the host of two podcasts right now. The one that I'm working most regularly on is called Discovery Debrief, a Star Trek podcast, where during the first season of the new Star Trek series, Star Trek Discovery, we recapped and discussed and analyzed every episode as it came out. Now that that first season is finished, we're getting ready to do our full season review with our regular panel, which will be me, my wife Rachel, Zaki Hassan from Zaki's Corner, and Cicero Holmes from the awesome Spawn on Me gaming podcast. And we're going to be joined by none other than my good friend Justin Bolger, because he's also a really big Star Trek fan. He's one of the only other people who is like conversant in episode titles. So like we can just like text each other and be like, "Oh man, today was an all good things kind of day, wasn't it?" And he'll just be like, "LOL, yeah, totally." So that'll be really great. Take a look at that coming up. And then my other podcast is called Comics on Consoles, which takes a look specifically at comics-based video games. I'm gearing up to do the 10th episode, which is going to be on the 2008 Iron Man game, published by Sega and developed by Secret Level. But I've got 9 other issues out there. I call them issues, even though they're podcast episodes. But I've got 9 other ones out there that delve to the Batman Begins video game, and we had Sean Gerber as a guest on that one. We did Superman Returns, the video game, which is not a great game, but has had a pretty interesting conversation.
Yeah, it made for a good episode for Comics on Console.
Oh, thank you, sir. Yeah, much appreciated. And then one of the other ones that I'm proud of, I did an episode about a really, really terrible video game called Aquaman Battle for Atlantis, which is infamously bad, but it's got kind of an interesting story surrounding it. So that one was a lot of fun to put together. So hope you check that stuff out. And again, gentlemen, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
No problem. And Chris, if I could just throw my name into the ring, if you ever want to do an episode on Superman 64, I'm your guy, because I think I'm one of the few who actually paid for that game.
Hey, oh man, do I got a story to tell you that? All right, consider yourself slotted. Yes, that's going to happen.
All right. Well, thanks again, Chris, for joining us. And for those of you who are not familiar with Tim and myself, you can find us on the Star Wars The Saga Continues podcast, where we talk all things about Star Wars, but specifically, we tend to focus on the upcoming movies. I'm sure we'll be talking a whole lot more about the Han Solo movie as we're getting closer to that. And we're also big fans of Star Wars Battlefront and Star Wars Rebels and all that fun stuff. And you can find us on Twitter at Star Wars TSC. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Star Wars The Saga Continues. And our website is starwarstsc.com. And we'd love to have you guys check us out if you're looking for a new Star Wars podcast. And Tim, you want to give us the rundown on all the info about the Thunderquack website and Patreon and all that good stuff?
Yeah, definitely. So as always, you could check out Thunderquack at thunderquack.com for all the podcasts, including Star Wars The Saga Continues, Rebel Cells, Quiver the Green Arrow podcast, and tons of other cool podcasts as part of the network. And then also you can help support us and the network by going to Patreon at patreon.com/Thunderquack, where you see the different tiers and cool gifts that or for the patrons, depending on the tier level that you could help support us with, and any support that we get is much appreciated. So that's where you could check out the network.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys again for joining us. To all our listeners who tuned in, thank you very much. We appreciate your support, and we will see you guys later.
See ya.
Goodbye.